I think that not everything not there, but maybe. Yeah. Like the sign, you're getting like better. So welcome to part. Start in about 2 minutes, so feel free to grab some of the donuts and coffee on the back. And be prepared, we're very exciting. Yeah. 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 Hopefully everyone their coffee and their donut already and their job. Right? Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Bill Gray Speaker Series presented by the Center for Urban Studies at the Junia School of Urban Studies and Planning. My name is Jenny Liu, as many of you already know. I'm the director of CUS and an associate professor here in the school. And this is very exciting because this is our first in-person Bill Gray speaker event since the start of the pandemic, and also since I've taken over CUS. And so we are super excited to have Dr. Junia Howell with us today. And before I jump into introducing her, let me tell you a little bit about this annual speaker series. So this Bill Gray speaker series is generously sponsored by Dr. Bill Gray, an alumnus of our school who graduated and obtained his PhD here in 1984 before becoming the first chancellor of Washington State University, and where he retired from a few years ago. So now on to our distinguished speaker for today. Dr. Junia Howell is an accomplished urban sociologist and race scholar whose work focuses on urban sociology, race and ethnicity, inequality and mobility, examining and addressing the intricate connections between race, capitalism, and housing disparities. So prior to her current affiliation at the University of Illinois Chicago, she was a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh, and she obtained her PhD in sociology from Rice University. Dr. Howell's work has delved into understanding the mechanisms that perpetuate housing inequities and racial disparities, shedding light on the complex social system that uphold white supremacy. And she has gone beyond academic research in a lot of her work and has spearheaded community-based initiatives and collaborations to expose the underlying causes of the systemic oppression and also empower individuals and communities to dismantle these systems through collective action. So here in the School of Urban Studies and Planning and the Center for Urban Studies, we are super proud of the commitment and dedication of our faculty members, students, alumni, as well as many of our community members who are here today that are already working on some of these very pressing social issues like housing inequities and racial disparities. So it is my hope that Dr. Howell's talk today will not only highlight the importance of all of the work and contributions that our school and all of those associated are doing, but also provide some fresh perspectives and serve as a catalyst for future collaboration and innovation within our community, foster new dialogues, and inspire some new ideas that can advance our collective action for a just future. So without further ado, please welcome our 2023 Bill Gray speaker, Dr. Junia Howell, to speak on the legitimizing and dismantling system of oppression, how empirical research can uncover and collective action can transform housing inequities. Please welcome.
Thank you, Jeannie, for that very, very generous and kind introduction. It is a wonderful pleasure to be with you all today. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to meet and engage with some of you. Sorry, I pretend that I can double task and talk and do this, and then I realize I can't. So give me just a second, full screen mode. All right, now I can talk. But it really has been a pleasure to get to meet a handful of faculty and community members the last 36 hours. I'm really excited to get to speak with you and super excited for dialogue with you about some of the things I've been working on and to hear more about what you're working on in situations here in Portland. So what I find as absolutely delightful about speaking to urban studies planning people is I don't have to start with convincing you why cities are great and habitable, nor do I even have to tell you that they're kind of broken right now, from racial residential segregation to affordable housing to enormous issues of pollution. I'm living on the East Coast, and obviously we have some issues right now with pollution caused by climate change, which obviously creates all sorts of other issues in our cities, health inequalities, not to mention how this is all interconnected with growing racial and socioeconomic wealth gaps, right? So we know we have lots of issues. And I imagine that, like myself, each of you in various ways have spent years thinking about not only what these issues are, but how might we actually mend them? How might we come to a more equitable and just place, because we know that cities can be incredible. So what I'm hoping to do today is share with you my musings on this that I've been working on. Some of it stretching over a decade, some of the things that I've been thinking more intensely about in the last couple of years. And I'm going to start by stepping back a little bit and diving into this question of what is the value of land. That can feel very esoteric and huge, but it's also super incredible. No, that's not essential. I'm going to just change the word I'm using. Essential to so many different things that we talk about. And then I'm going to move from there, from talking about, well, what if we reimagined this value of the land and its impact on all these things? What could that look like? How could we restore equity? And then finally, how do we actually get there from here? So we're here, how do we actually get there? I'm going to share what I'm working on and some of my musings on that, and I would love to hear your responses. So that's our roadmap. That's where we're headed today. And we're going to dive into it in various ways. But I want to start by looking at this question of land by thinking about where we're sitting. So I don't know if you guys have this habit. It's a kind of a bad habit of mine, but I'm obsessed with like any place I go, checking out Zillow and seeing what the properties are, and all sorts of different ways. Actually, if I'm like visiting someone and I get real nosy and I like really want to know something about the neighborhood. So this was my earlier this week coming to Portland, thinking about where I was going to be, and I was looking at a couple of properties. So we have over here, these are currently on sale on Zillow. I just stole them, so I'm being very honest about my acquisitions here. These pictures, I hope that there's no copyright written or anything about that. Anyways, there's my honest. This is where it comes from. So there's a 4-bedroom, 2-bath, almost 1,400 square foot, nice house. Just a couple blocks north, less than a mile, there's another apartment. Now you guys are going to understand this space way better than I do, obviously. 2 beds, 3 baths, 1,200 square feet. Updated amenities, also looks like quite enjoyable and delightful. It's got an interesting view there. And so I'm curious, when you have 2 properties like this, are they currently valued the same? So we got A and we have B. I need some guesses. What do you think these properties might be valued at?
Where the location is. B is much higher.
B is much higher. Okay, how much higher?
60%.
60% higher. Well, no.
No, because I think that B has a HOA that's close to 800 or 900, and so that's practical the price point of that. Yeah.
Okay, and just to clarify that where these points are is physically where they're located on Google Maps. So if you can situate, I think that was one of the questions. All right, any other guesses? I mean, we're just like guessing. I don't really expect people to know.
B is higher.
B, okay, so B is higher, might be pulled down by HOA. You know what that stands for, I just can't say. Any other thoughts before I show you? All right, so we're not.
We weren't sharing this size.
Oh, because I switched and I wasn't sharing. I'm so sorry to the people. My bad.
I think we should be good now.
Thank you. Okay, for not, just tell me and I can rewrite that. All right, so those who guessed B was much higher were right almost twice as high. So more than 60%. Okay, so given what you guys know about the city, why?
Where it's located, the taxes.
Okay, so tax, so location, taxes. What about, so the location, the main reason is the taxes, or are there other things about the location?
The 405 is.
Okay, so being that close to the highway is so horrible that it's going to devalue that first A property. Okay.
Views would increase the value.
Views, okay. So the attractiveness of views. All right, so there are all these reasons, and we're going to dive into those and many more about what contemporarily makes prices of houses and land can broadly value differently. But I'm also curious about over time. So this is that first one that I showed you. This is the outside of it. And so I looked at the county records of what it sold for in the last 2 decades. Yes. Does that surprise you? No, it's just so shocking to see. So that, let me see if I can move the mouse so that the Zoom thing goes right. And are we sharing now? Are we good on the sharing?
Okay.
All right, let's see if Zoom goes away. We'll see. So why has it gone up like
that? Availability of capital.
Okay, availability of capital.
Easy to get a mortgage.
Yeah, okay. And that whole time period?
Maybe not the whole time period.
Or most of it?
Low interest rates.
Okay, except that it's on sale now.
Yeah.
and.
But then you were also looking at the whole graph.
Yeah. But it is interesting that like where we are with interest rates right now. So yes, capital interest, absolutely. Other periods. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I'm really just curious, like, what narratives are you guys hearing? You feel even if you just agree with them, what narrative? Yeah.
Demand was high.
Okay. That's with the university. Really, no one feels like that. Even if it's true, you feel like. Okay, is there any others? So, oh, sorry.
Being rehab, I mean, if it went from 100 to 400, was that an older unit that was
More
someone wanted to
yeah.
fix it up?
Absolutely. So part of it might have been yeah, it wasn't recent, it doesn't look like it's recently, but in that 2 decades, absolutely. It might have been doing something. So yeah, it could be a part of it. I'm sorry, Peter, I'm like making you work for this. Give me instruction if I'm too all over the place about it. So yes, all of those reasons obviously are part of it. The demand one is the one that like I'm constantly getting thrown out in various ways. And supply, we need more supply, right? And so a couple years ago now, and then this was increased with some international work that I was doing. I started digging into it more and more and recognizing that across the country, we have more housing units and housing square footage per person than we've ever had in history, which many of you probably know that, unlike a lot of the broader Republic I'm looking at. But I was curious, because I'm not trying every place. So I was like, okay, let's go down in Portland. So this is the population growth in Portland. No, if we can get that top back away.
Click on more.
Could cite it, all right, the curtains. Thank you. I was like, we did it earlier and I don't remember what we did. Thank you. You guys are amazing. We'll do communal tech here. Population and our Portland population. All right, our issue here now is all right, maybe we'll get this eventually. And this is the housing supply. So just simple division there. The supply per unit per person here in Portland has stayed pretty constant, pretty much a national par-ish, while the prices have expanded. So a kind of a traditional, obviously it's way more complicated than that, but a traditional way of looking at supply doesn't explain this issue either at all or in full. And I would argue, like as already said, that it's less of a supply issue and more of a capital distribution issue. So that's what I want to get into more today. But before we dive a full deep, I'm interested where you guys started learning about these explanations. I think about it, I think about my childhood, and I'm curious, when did you guys start learning reasons why properties were valued different values because of where they were located or because of what time it was or the interest rates? When did you start getting those rationales in your life? You didn't know if you worked today. You were sitting there like you just want to sit there for an hour and a half and not talk and like check out. And I'm like, no, you are my students today. You have to work. I need you to talk. Yes.
I was smaller, I took a river, and I always wanted to be by the beach, but they told me that by the beach was more expensive. You cannot afford it, so that's where I ran. So location is important.
Yeah, that's an example.
I was going to say too, childhood, certainly we rented and you could see where the people, and I'm from a small town. And so even it's almost, it was more stark in my town than just the disparities between who got to live there.
Yeah.
What the houses look like in the hills versus down low or
Yeah.
in your town.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, my childhood is in China, so it's different. But I learned it first from Monopoly.
Oh my gosh, do tell. When did you start playing Monopoly? Properties were a different value. Wait, was that in childhood that you started learning Monopoly or playing Monopoly, or is that a little older? That is amazing. Never gotten that answer. That's incredible. Priceless. So we're all going for what is it? Boardwalk? Right? Is that the most expensive? I've honestly not played Monopoly in a hot minute. Yeah.
So I started learning, when we would go to my father's house, where he grew up, we were very poor. It was on the south side. And so the neighborhood, the region of town was coded as like lesser than. And so the house was like very rickshaw, like very like put together, like weird additions, unflat things. And even the bathroom toilet, there were issues with that. And so we would talk about how this house, because it was built differently, no less money.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
on and so forth. And then of course also the renter.
Yeah.
Oh, those are the renters, the apartments.
Yeah. But the mix of studying this and speaking to people and students and real estate agents and people in the industry, like the more I sit with it, the more I realize how long ago and how deep, especially in America, obviously in different international contexts, the story is different, and how you're introduced to US manifestations of that inequality can be different through board games or living here. But for those who grew up in the US, there's a very deep association with these kind of moralistic understandings of who belongs where, and that we literally put a price tag to that, that we justify in all these ways. So as I, a few years ago, was reflecting on that, I started thinking about where did that happen for me in my own childhood? So I grew up in Cincinnati, which, like most cities around the country, is racially segregated. I like to call our pattern like the I pattern. So the Black population is highly concentrated in the middle of the city, and the white population is concentrated on the east and the west. And especially when I was growing up, and even now, there's a very small Latinx and Asian population. It's mainly a Black-white city. And I grew up like smack in the middle of this map in a predominantly Black community. This is my lovely childhood home, an old 100-year-old Victorian home. In Cincinnati parlance, we call it like a two-family. So like my parents moved in, it was a two-family, and the family lived upstairs and we lived downstairs. Later, my parents took over the whole house. But this, very big windows, big ceilings, all these kind of things that personally I now like love, and that kind of old architecture. And I have this memory, now obviously there were seeds planted before this time, but I have this memory of being about in middle school, and my sister had been taking piano lessons, and my parents heard, like from a friend of a friend, that there was someone moving out of town, and they had a piano that they were selling secondhand. So my parents were like, oh, we can get a piano for my sister. I have no clue why, and no one has better memory of this than me, so no one can fill in the details. But for some reason, I had to go along with my dad and my sister to check out this piano. I don't know where the other siblings were, and I don't know why I was going along. But anyway, so we drove over to the east side of Cincinnati and the Hyde Park area, and we got to this house, and I was immediately like intrigued. I was like, oh my gosh, this is our house is twinning. And like we're walking in, and like I could care less about piano. I mean, still kind of care less about piano. I definitely didn't care about like sitting there and talking about something about keys, but I was totally like checking out the fireplace and like the I don't know if any of you are familiar with this kind of houses, but it's like this green Victorian marble that like, who thought that was good idea? I have no clue. But I was like, they have the same marble and they have the pocket doors and like it's the same layout. Like I just thought it was like the coolest thing ever. And of course, like me and my naivety felt like no one else was paying attention to this. And so like I got out and like got back in the car, and I wanted to explain to my dad, like, did you see da-da-da-da? And like my dad loves architecture and like is very aware of these things. Of course, he's like, yeah, of course. And little did I know that he had picked up the like brochure on the outside, because they were moving out of town, the house was for sale. They had that, pre-internet here, right? Like the like outside the like pamphlet of how much the house was worth. So we started getting in this conversation, and my dad looked at the price and he was aghast. So okay, we're talking a few decades back now, and we're talking in Cincinnati, but why this number was so shocking was about 10 years prior to this, my parents had bought our entire house for $38,000. And retrospectively, I can estimate that if they had sold it at this moment, they might have been able to get 68-ish for it. And this is why my dad was like, he knew it was going to be unequal, but he was shocked at how unequal it was. And so, like often in my household growing up, it led to a conversation about race and history. And so we talked about how our neighborhood had the concentrations of factories, and almost all the public housing in the neighborhood was concentrated, or in the city was concentrated in the area, and that racist understandings of both where those policies, how those policies happened and where things should be placed, but also people's assumptions about race and poverty meant that people didn't want to live in our neighborhood, so the demand was down. So these explanations of historical policies and real estate demand were the ones that like were beginning to plant the seeds of why this was so unequal. And so those, yes, it was racism, but racism manifested in this way. So that's the main explanation that I took with me, and I went to college outside Chicago, and ended up returning back to Cincinnati and working for a while, and getting a little frustrated and disillusioned with some of the policies I was working on, and decided to go to grad school in Houston and begin to actually study this more robustly. So when I got to Houston, like, again, most cities in the country is highly segregated. Its pattern has predominantly the white population concentrated on the west side of the city, and the Black and Latinx population, I like to say they're like in pie slices on the east side of the city. And when I started looking at housing, I immediately started seeing this pattern, but even in a more extreme way. So this is more recent. These are for a couple of years ago when I was studying it, and to be honest, I was giving a presentation on this at first, and like 2 years ago, and I went to the two neighborhoods I knew would probably be the best, like comparable looking houses, and these were literally the first two houses I picked. Okay, so we have some like comparable space, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you. That is the appropriate response. Do we want to try? Yes. 10 times difference. So there's just like an enormous, immense amount of just stark inequality. But as I was working on it more, and ended up started to be a collaboration with my now dear friend and collaborator Elizabeth Corbett, we started to trade these stories of people we knew living and buying and selling houses in Black and Latinx neighborhoods in Houston. And repeatedly, we were seeing this really common pattern that they would get multiple offers on their houses, and they would pick whatever one they thought was the best. And then the appraiser would come in and be like, no, the house isn't worth that. The house is worth this. And the sale would either fall through, or they'd have to take a short sale, and then we were just seeing it over and over and over. And we're like, what is going on with the appraisers? Like, how can they justify this? Like, how can their sense of this is what the real estate demand is be so different than what people are actually willing to put an offer on who have a loan lined up? And so we began looking at this systematically, and it's literally been 11 years of working on appraisals and trying to understand this more. And it started, again, in collaboration with Elizabeth Corbett, looking at using interviews and ethnographies and observations, trying to understand how appraisers, and not just appraisers, all the actors in the industry, in the housing industry, were making this decision of what something should be appraised for and then also assessed for. And we began to get these really dramatic examples where appraisers would say to us, well, if I was appraising a house in historic Fifth Ward, which is a historic Black neighborhood in Houston, and I couldn't find a comp or a comparable sale right there, I would pull from, and then they would give examples of other Black neighborhoods that are actually really different than the one they're talking about. And they would deliberately say, but we wouldn't use the Second Ward, which is super similar in history and socioeconomic conditions and space and all these things, but is predominantly Latinx. Another very striking example was an appraiser who was appraising a house in the near north side, and Elizabeth actually went with him to do this appraisal. It's a deed-restricted middle-class Latinx neighborhood that he routinely called the ghetto, confessed he was scared to do an appraisal in this space, and clarified that because he couldn't find a comp exactly where he wanted, he was going to pull from Quail Valley, which is so far I can't fit in a way for him to have. And it's a Latinx lower class neighborhood that's not deed restricted, doesn't have any of the same history or buildings. But he made sure to tell Elizabeth that he would not pull a comp from the Heights, which is just across the highway, and before there was a highway, it was basically the same neighborhood, and that is a deed restricted but middle class white neighborhood. Moreover, if he had to pull a comp for the Heights and couldn't get in the Heights, he would pull it from West University Place, which is one of the most affluent white neighborhoods in the city. So example after example after example is very clear that race and the racial composition in the neighborhood was driving how they were selecting comps and evaluating the value of the property, both the land and the houses. So we empirically were like, okay, well, let's try to figure this out. And this was a few years after Dodd-Frank had passed, and we knew that they were collecting for the first time all the appraisal data. And so we're like, oh, we can just ask Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for this uniform appraisal data set. And we're like, oh, they're not super excited. Well, we can split it. Yeah, that turned into a decade-long fight. Good news is we have some of that data now, and I'll come back to that. But in the meantime, we're like, what kind of proxies can we use? So we used tax assessments. We did all these double checks. Harris County has actually some of the best property. If you want to start with some property taxes, start there, kind of reduce it is. So, and they also have it's a huge county, right? So they have over 1 million single family homes, like there's all these benefits. And so we combined it to all these different data sources and published our first mixed methods piece, pulling on both the qualitative and the quantitative data. And on the quantitative side, we first just said, okay, just looking at racial composition, what's the gap here? And of course, that is, holding things constant, that's pretty large, but as we've already talked about, there's housing characteristic differences that are then racialized for historical and contemporary reasons. So, everything from the fireplace to the size of the house, and then as well as like the quality of the condition, how recently was it updated. Yay for data, we could control for all that. So when you control for it, as you would expect, that inequality decreases. If it didn't, we'd really be in a mess, but it's still quite stark and enormous. And so then obviously the next thing that pops into people's heads is neighborhood conditions. Because we were looking at one county and not doing national, we just got to have lots of fun. So everything from the exact amount of feet it takes to walk from the front door to the nearest park, like fun GIS stuff that now I'm like, wow, how did I have time for that? But anyway, all these fun variables of crime and school rates and things that are all racialized, and should we put them in the model? That's a whole different discussion. But if we're going to talk about it for a second, let's put it in the model to just isolate the effect of race. And once again, yes, it decreases, but honestly, not nearly as much as we even expected, and much less as anyone who talks about neighborhood and location would expect. Like, that is not that different. Finally, looking at real estate demand, so the kind of best economic measures we have, how long is it on the market, is it cutting it, the sense of how much demand is there for this house. In fact, we've now done this in a lot of different ways. Demand don't matter. Demand is not, this method is not capturing demand. So that led us on a much bigger question of where did this method come from? Why is it still being used? And why is this being justified? So just to capture that before I go and explain that, the difference here, holding everything constant, is almost 250%. So again, this is absolutely everything you can imagine being held constant. Okay, I'm realizing that I have no clock, which is not how my phone feels. So give me a second. I'm actually going to pull out my phone, which I never like to do, because I thought I had a clock, and I don't like that happening. All right, cool. So we wondered, was it in all cities, and was it getting, no, those, I'm sorry, I'm discombobulated. I put those in a different order. Forget that those slides there. Clock, or back to 1452, just, yesterday. And I go all the way back here, because literally, as I have traced this in this law, this is where it's led me. And it's led me to the first, wait, what just happened?
I'm just excited to find out more about this.
I know.
That's nice.
All right, cool. I just had totally lost my train of thought, and so I was in a different, and then everyone's laughing, and I'm like, did I just do something crazy? I'm insane. Okay, it's a pope. Doctrine of discovery. That's the word I couldn't find in my head that I just got so confused about. All right, doctrine of discovery. So this is pre what we think about now as the era of settler colonial, but it's the legal document that literally is cited in multiple Supreme Court cases to this day that serves in so many ways to justify settler colonialism, but in this particular way, to justify the notion that not only is it right from those from European empires to take over violently land, but that land is only valued, or the value of that land is based on who's inhabiting it. So it literally was this notion that property is worth something based on how useful it is to white people. So they used it to justify, and there's a lot of historical documentation about this and how it went in these treaties, but it used to justify that they could buy the land for nothing because it was literally worth nothing, because it was inhabited by indigenous people and they didn't know how to use it and they weren't providing any value to it. But as soon as it was no longer in their dominion, it increased in value because it was now useful to white people. So, I mean, this feels philosophical and huge, but it literally is the thing that's still being justified in various ways legally to justify how we think about properties. So fast forward a few centuries, and we get to the late 1800s, and this is where planners, before we would necessarily call it that, social scientists, were starting to map the value of space. So this was happening first in London and then in various cities in the US, where they would literally color, right, what things were valued. And thanks to people in my own discipline and others, they thought, this is clearly some kind of naturalistic determination that where white people are, it's just always more valuable. Like, let's not think about that we just literally created that system. Let's just justify it literally using eugenicists and social Darwinism and naturalize this whole conception. So you see this happening with the Chicago school and the ways that these levels are projected. And then more precisely in the real estate space, you get Richard Ely. I'm wondering how many people in this room know anything about Richard Ely? Okay, we don't have to go into history. I was just curious because I had someone write me out of the blue from the public this morning who was like asking me about Richard Ely, and I was like, maybe he's more known in certain circles. But okay, so he was a professor in Wisconsin, and he's the first one who like pulls on what's going on in the Chicago school, pulls on like early planning stuff to formalize and naturalize this notions into real estate itself. So he's like working on this, and this is at the time where, you know, we're talking 10s, 20s, all disciplines, academic and not, are really trying to legitimize themselves, including real estate. So they have recently formed the first real estate board, you know, the one that notoriously didn't let Black realtors be called realtors, right? Like, you know that history, that's what, this is the same group. So they hire Richard Ely to write the first real estate textbook, and in that textbook, he like pulls on these vast and these formal and naturalistic theories to insinuate that not only is this like inherent and necessary, but this is how real estate needs to continue to evaluate property, is based on this notion of where white people live, that's the most valuable, and then from there, whatever racial hierarchy we're currently pulling on, everyone ranks somewhere under that. A couple years later, his student who studied under him, Frederick Babcock, was then hired by the same group to pull out from the real estate textbook a whole book on appraising. So this is the first book on appraising, and this is where this idea of sales comparison approach really starts emerging. It didn't really exist before that, that's not what was really happening. I mean, it had some, it was inconsistent, but he's the one who really solidifies, that's right, this idea as like a formal method, this is how we do it. Now, they were still having trouble having any kind of national play. Like, it's an association, but it doesn't have a lot of national range. That all changes when the stock market crashes and the housing falls apart, and there's a huge housing crisis, which leads in part to FDR's election, and a key part of his platform is he's going to address housing. So in his 1934 National Housing Act, radically reshifts all of housing. Hopefully many of you are at least somewhat familiar with things that happened in that, including the creation of the FHA. But as part of that, they go, okay, we are now off, we're going, let me step back, I went too fast. One of their big things was they realized that how mortgages were structured weren't working. So if you don't know this, at the time, the average mortgage was 3 to 5 years, more of them on the 3 side than the 5 side. And you had to pay on average 50% down. So if you had to do that today in Portland, ain't nobody this is very probably, right? Like, that's crazy. So what would happen often is people would be paying it off and then they get a second mortgage when they couldn't finish in those 3 to 5 years. So the stock market crashed and everyone lost their jobs. That's what started this snowball of housing crisis and into the renting crisis, because all these mortgages don't get paid off. So FDR was like, well, it's mentioned, was like, okay, we need to address this by extending the length of the mortgages. And oh yeah, by the way, when they were paying those mortgages, they only paid interest to the end, and then they had to pay all the capital. They didn't pay interest. So they weren't building on it, right? So that's where this idea of mortgages as we know them come from, this time period where they're like, first it was 15, now we've extended that obviously in many places to 30, but 15-year-long mortgages where you pay both capital and interest as you go along. They're consistent, they're always regulated. So how are we gonna get the banks to radically shift from 3 years to 15? Paying capital, like, this is not a deal for the banks. The federal government is like, we'll make a deal. We'll take all the risk by insuring it. So if you think about this, like 2008 should just like start screaming in your head. That decisions made in 1934 might not have been always the best, but in order to insure, they're like, we can't just insure anything for any price. We have to know at some level that like it's not a crazy price that you're paying. AK, here comes appraising. So they turn to Frederick Bagak, the guy I just mentioned. They hire him. He's hired by the FHA. He works for the FHA for years and creates, in collaboration with these new agencies, the first underwriting manual for the federal government. In that underwriting manual, you have all these like matrices and understandings of how to look at like appeal and economic stability and these things that actually are still super like dead on, but it's still in the federal underwriting manual. But you also have this really critical element of explaining the sales comparison approach for the first time in this very explicit step-by-step way. And that included a couple things. One is centralizing location. Before this, location might not have to really do with the formal appraisal. Like, yes, race was still always playing a role in various ways, but not necessarily in this formal calculation. Now it was your location matters more than anything else. And you're going to figure out how that is valued based on past or previous sales. That's the whole idea of the method. And so in order to figure out where those neighborhood boundaries are, we're going to draw maps. Now, obviously, these maps were made by lots of different agencies. There's a whole amazing, interesting history. Some of them were what we now call like Holt maps or redlining maps. But when it comes into the appraising space, what was really important was not the you can't loan here. It was actually that it was A, B, C, D. It was the A's that mattered just as much as the B and the C's and D's. Or in other words, sometimes they call it greenlining, right? It was saying it wasn't just, oh, this is where mortgages could be. This is how much your house should be valued, and more importantly, where you should pull comps from. So it was the baseline of how you actually use these comps. So that keeps being used with all sorts of other racist elements of that law. Those start to be challenged in the 60s. You get national fair housing. National fair housing does not touch appraising at all, but it opens the door to start challenging appraising and lawsuits. And so those lawsuits kind of culminate in the Community Reinvestment Act, which does start to deal with appraising. And in that, with combination with a few other legal, I mean, our law in our country is more straightforward, right? So it's a combination of like 6 million different things. But now appraisers are no longer allowed to explicitly say race is the reason. And they're not allowed to explicitly use a map that was only defined by race. But they still are supposed to pull on past sales in similar neighborhoods that have a precedent of being defined as a neighborhood. AKA, we didn't change Jack. We just took the race word out, and we want you to be happy with it. So if we look from there and progress forward and just say, okay, since this point, how has racial inequality and appraised values changed? Again, we're not holding anything constant right now. We're just like demographically across the country averages. The gap between white neighborhoods and communities of color has doubled. So obviously we've got some historical issues, but we also got some contemporary issues. And so part of that was investigating this in this second publication where we were looking first in a way that we did with the first publication. Okay, let's just hold constant some housing neighborhood characteristics, blah, blah, blah. And we see that not only is the gap still there, it's actually more dramatic. What this tells us, like a fun mathy without going into all the weeds way, is in 1980, there's a lot of proxies that end up serving for race that are not the same proxies happening now. In other words, let's go back to my Houston example. You have a lot of Houston Black middle class and Latinx middle class very robust neighborhoods. In 1980, you throw a class variable into the model, it looks like race isn't mattering. By 2015, you really see how much race is mattering because that's all they got, because it's not class anymore. So, there's also, we did demand models, we looked, one of my favorites is actually, which I don't have here, but just like nerdy wise, we did a dynamic panel modeling where you look at like what's the past, how did that affect and versus now. So basically like isolating out redlining effect versus now. And while of course it's affecting history, is always affecting us, it's way more of a bigger effect now. So what that means also in practice is over this time span, if you held everything else constant about the houses and neighborhoods, blah, 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 the appreciation in value is this different across white neighborhoods versus communities of color. So racial wealth gap, super connected to how these appraise appreciation. So if you've been in the country, you've probably seen a lot of news around appraising, which is interesting as someone who's been working on it for a while, and 10 years ago couldn't get a single reporter to pick up any story we gave them, and working year after year, and now very gratefully having a lot of news and a lot of government play, but also that also always has its downside too, because you're like, that wasn't the story, but cool, thanks for talking about it. But anyway, so that culminated in, if you are not aware, 2 years ago, Biden announced his PAVE initiative actually in this month, which is his housing platform that is centered around appraising and built largely off of this research that I was showing you. And so part of that was them working on releasing that data that we had been trying to get for decades. And so gratefully in October, they did release that data, an aggregated form of it, and I did the first analysis on that data, which was very similar to the ones I've just shown you, but now with appraisal data itself. So everything else I've shown you is proxy data because it's all we had. And so you can imagine I speak to appraisers all the time, and they're like, we don't have our actual data. They have a lot of attitude, in my opinion, and they're telling me that I don't have the right data. And I'm like, so I was like, it was real fun. It was real fun to get the real data and be like, really? You think it's the data? Let's see. Okay, so just connecting it to all sorts of, neighborhood amenities and housing characteristics, etc. I know I'm still going fast, and I got so much more. We're gonna just keep going fast, but I want to give you a little,
I don't know if I can, like,
yeah, go for it.
I just want to ask a devil's advocate question, I guess. Race is so central to so many institutions, not just appraisers, it's also the home buyers. And a lot of appraisals confirm a bid. They're not actually pulled out of thin air. They're buyers and sellers, someone makes an offer, the appraiser largely, say 95%.
So we actually have that data now, because in this data set, we have what the buyer put and what the appraiser came back.
Okay.
You want to guess if they're more likely to match in a white neighborhood or a community of color? Quite different. Yeah, so, oh yeah. And actually, before they released the data, Freddie Mac did that analysis, because we had been pushing them to. And they came out, Freddie Mac came out first and was like, oh yeah, in communities of color, they're way more likely to come under the agreed upon contract price. So yes, there is this notion among white people that appraisers just come in and give a stamp, because that's what they do for white people. That's not what they're doing across the board. So yeah, you're not wrong in that kind of general assumption, but it's a racialized experience that we can empirically show is happening for some and not for others. And you're also not wrong that all these things are interconnected, right? And when I'm saying appraisals right now, I mean the method. The real estate agent uses the method, the broker uses the method. I'm interested in how we're getting to these values, the value of land. Yes, the physical appraiser who comes is a piece of that, but I'm less interested in their role as the approach being used across the industry. And as I already mentioned, haven't gone into extreme detail, but in each of these papers, we've also done various things to look at demand. And one of the interesting, so I was testifying in Congress a few months ago on this, and it's always experience where you just have to try to stay as poised as possible. And when you really just want to pull out your hair like crazy, or at least that's my internal process. And there was just all these pushbacks, which I always get about well, sure, you might have variables, but actually people just want to live in white neighborhoods. But there is so much racist assumptions in that sentence, right? So first of all, our country has increasingly become people of color over this time period that we're talking about. People of color, generally speaking, and there's a lot of different research that looks at this, are way more interested in living in diverse or communities of color. They're not interested in living in super white neighborhoods, generally, right? Super white neighborhoods. And people, so this notion that the inequality is increasing and increasing, but it's just because everybody wants more and more white numbers. No, people are actually increasingly demanding communities of color. The other thing when we do national comparisons, which I'm about to get more into in a second here too, is cities that are the most racially diverse, generally speaking, have the most inequality here. And they also have the highest demands for their communities of color. So it's, we swallow that it's all these things, and it is. There is demand playing a role of it, but it's not nearly as much as we want to believe. And I'm saying we very generally here. So thank you. And thank you for letting me just play with it back. But getting on that, there's differences across countries. So anytime we're doing national analysis, the national analysis I showed you, if you just threw all the neighborhoods in the country in one model, you'd end up with a big mess. Trust me, I've done it, and it's a hot mess, and other scholars have done it, and I've seen the results, and I'm that's a mess. Because obviously, just pure housing value Kansas to a predominantly Asian neighborhood in San Francisco, like, with, like, we can't have that conversation, right? So we needed to have, how I approach that is having separate models for all of them, which means you just end up having a lot of models. So for this most recent work with the data released from appraisers from the government itself, we used 105 metropolitan areas. We made that cutoff by having at least 500,000 residents and 50,000 residents of color. We just need enough robustness in the data to be able to like run these models. Is really the only reason it's cutoff. But I'm not satisfied by just running 105 models. I wanted to run one for every year of the data they released. So that was like a few more. And then we needed to look at every type of appraisal that they released, sales, refinance, all together. And then they released mean and median, you can't leave that out. And of course, you need to look at different kinds of models, and I wanted to look at different racial conceptions. And so you kind of get to just a couple models. So, if we want, we can go through each of the coefficients, all 23,000, and be here until Sunday. But obviously, that's not an effective way to talk about national models. Instead, I'm going to use weighted averages. And so instead of just doing a straight average, I'm going to weight it by the population so that we kind of have a lived experience of the average person's experience in the US. So doing that, this most recent work asked 5 questions. First, just most recent data, what's the inequality across white neighborhoods and communities of color? Second, how has it changed over this time period that they released the data for? Third, did the pandemic have an effect on it? Fourth, what's up with the really hot markets? Fifth, is there differences across different communities of color? So to that first question of what's just the status, I'm showing you the 2021 results, which is what was released in the fall in the first result. A couple weeks ago, I released a 2022 update, and I'm going to show you the Portland 22, but I didn't update this for various reasons. But if you want the most up-to-date data, they are in both. Anyways, so just descriptively looking across, as the white proportion goes up in 2021, so does the home value. For our ability to talk about this semi-quickly and understand, we're going to take the 2 extremes. What I mean by this is all the neighborhoods in all these cities are in the model. Everybody's included. We're just using their exact racial proportion, and we're putting it into a linear regression. And now I'm showing you the results of that linear regression. And for conversation's sake, I'm going to take one end and the other end, all white neighborhoods and all communities of color. Again, we're just talking about the coefficients in net inequality. So that is the difference, a quite stark, huge difference with no controls in the model. Again, we have lots of controls. We've even found new ones because I keep doing it and finding new fun ways to control for things. That's the difference there. So across the country, $400,000 holding everything about the neighborhood and the house the same. That's an over 2 times difference from white neighborhoods versus communities. So how does this change over time? So I showed you we've been changing since 1980. Well, this happened since 2013 when this more robust data was available. The inequality has continued to increase. It's a little hard to visualize, to be honest, when you're looking at something like that. So let's just put some bars there, and then let's equalize all those bars so that you can see that that inequality has increased by 75% in the last 9 years. To put it, quite drastic. How did the pandemic affect this? I don't imagine any of you will be surprised by this, but if we start by just beginning the pandemic, we're going to hold constant and we're just going to look at appreciation for similar houses. Huge effect in just 2 years. 2020, 2021, that's it. In fact, that's a difference in appreciation of $76,000. Let's put that in historical context. From 1980 to 2010, on average per year, the gap in racial appraisal inequality increased $5,000. Every year, it's growing $5,000. That's insane. That's the racial wealth gap growing $5,000 every year. From 2013 to 2019, it was growing $6,000 a year. In those last 2 years, 7 times faster than the historical precedent. Finally, we get to the what about hot markets? So this is me being petty. This is me giving way too many talks to too many people and having this lovely pattern of the white man who comes up after my talk. It's like, that's all good and fine, but in my city, this pattern can't be happening because we have a really hot real estate market and all boats are rising with this time. It's a lovely conversation. I love this question. And so when this data came out, I was like, really? Let's see, Mr. like Boise, Idaho, that's had an inflation in 2 years of 55%. And every other hot market that has had an insane inflation. So there's 29 of them, identified them mathematically, whatever, la 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 la, look over time. Oh look, your inequality happens to be increasing. Let's put that in a comparative sense. So let's look at the cooler markets, the ones that aren't increasing in this crazy way. And well, okay, your inequality is increasing too. Not a good story. Like, we're still talking about inequality increasing. But let's look at the difference between the hottest and the cooler market as far as how much the inequality is increasing. Let me just go back a little fast. I'll say that number. Thank you, young white man who can say that. So 3 times greater. So finally, how will different communities cost? So you'll notice in this one, by others, they were more specific earlier, but I'm doing white versus community of color. And the main reason is when you're doing a national comparison, if you're comparing a city like Pittsburgh to a city like San Jose, if you are putting them on one, like you have a lot of issues. So, but because I'm actually running models for every single city, then I can actually tailor them to that city. So using Indigenous or American Indian, Alaskan Native, Black, East Asian, Latinx, South Asian, and Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander. So again, get real specific, real like where we know these things actually kind of play out. So what I did for this is I just used if your city had at least 50,000 of this group, then that group was included in the model. And then the national comparison I'm going to give you is a weighted average for that group. So it's the same thing, it's just not every group is included in every city. So now our baseline here, that 0, is white, again, holding everything constant, white neighborhoods. So you can see Black and Latinx are really similar to that national 2 times difference. Indigenous communities, much greater inequality going on here. East Asian is slightly higher, holding everything else constant, although interestingly, in the pandemic, that diverges. In other words, East Asian neighborhoods start de-appreciating compared to their whites. It seems like that's actually reversing starting in 2022, which again, in political context, these things matter, right? Southern Asian, it's so identical to white, you can't even see it. There is literally a bar there, you just can't see it. And then the really interesting one is Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander is the largest inequality. Okay, so just so you know, because I'm crazy and on my nonprofit site, I released all 105. So if you want to go look at a Portland or another city, it's there. But this is the 2022 Portland data. So similar analysis that I just showed you, and you can see those inequalities. So again, the Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander are so small here that there's enough of a population, it's in the model, which is saying something. A lot of cities don't have it in the model, but it's so small you can't even see it. And this is not difference, this is just dollars. What that really means is we're talking about model and coefficient. So I'm not saying, I know I don't need to explain this to you, but I have to explain all the time, someone else explain it. Like, I'm not saying the houses are actually worth 0, right? We're holding everything at the mean, and because those houses like probably aren't at the mean, then we're like all these things. What's important here is the difference, the inequality, that's what we're looking at. Okay, also, if you're curious, the data and all the files and everything is very good. Okay, we're almost done with this section, and I promise there's only 3 sections, this is 1. But I think it's really critical to highlight, after I'm talking about a whole bunch of inequality, that often when we talk about inequality, we fall into this default assumption that whatever is higher is a standard, and everything else must be implicitly broken. And then if we take that notion and walk forward to a solution, the implied solution is that we need to like bring everyone else up into this standard. But of course, other than being in this room, is I guess somebody get this, I have explained it's great. But whiteness is not a neutral baseline. These equations are not neutral. And when we assume that that's what we're living up to, we're never gonna get there, because they are the problem. In fact, just to give you some empirical data, we look across time, which line is out of sync with the historical precedent? The white neighborhoods. In fact, we look even more concentrated in these last few years. In the pandemic, what happened was a difference in white neighborhoods, not anywhere else. Likewise, if we take my personal story that I told you a hot minute ago now and look at this, I kind of feel bad. These people live in this house, and I like have stopped their house like this. Hopefully they never see any of this on the internet. Because I've like looked at all these like sale, I don't read too much about these people's house. Anyways, I don't know their names though, so maybe that's gonna be bad. Anyways, I got real into needing a soccer here, but I want to point out before, in 1960, the house I grew up in was valued slightly higher. You can see that that's not the story that's happened. So given that, what do we do this out? How do we get there? Okay, I'm gonna pause a second. I love that y'all are like nodding with me, so I'm just having super fun. Do we have, let me just check in though. Questions, are we good? Can we keep bulldozing forward?
Oh, capitalism, that's the next part, right?
That is the solution. All right. Okay, let's go. Let's have it. All right, so generally speaking, someone talked to me yesterday, and how ridiculous this. Yes, I like to say I have a 5-point plan to abolish. Anyways, so generally speaking, big picture, what I often particularly say, like in a policy realm, is to address this, we need to do two things. One is we have to deal with the reparations component, because we have 90 years of explicit policy that has created this, and it doesn't trace just then. I often now say, like, we have now 10 years of data that the federal government has with people's names and addresses, where we know that inequality has increased by 7%. Don't tell me we don't know how to do reparations because we don't know, we know their names. We know their addresses, like we have information. So there needs to be a component of how we address this that is redistributive, because we've created this, and if we don't redistribute it, like we have a big hole to dig out of. But even if we redistributed everything today and kept the method as we have it, we're going to end up right back there, because this method is explicitly, in its creation and in its current implications, racist, and it's going to recreate that hierarchy. So while I've been focusing on both, I'm going to focus today a little bit more on the method, because that's been a lot of what I've been doing. So I would argue that we need to get rid of the sales comparison approach altogether. I've become more and more convinced and overt that, yeah, sure, we could tweak it here, we could tweak it there. No tweaks are going to deal with the extent of issues that it has. So how do we get rid of it? Well, the first thing I argue is that we actually need to deliberately separate how we're conceptualizing the value of land from the value of, I'm going to use an interface word, enhancements. Using enhancements, that's a technical rounding word because it includes houses, but it also includes like a human-made lake and a dam and a barn and a ship, like so we need to think about these two differently. So first, let's talk about what we think about as enhancements, and now we call this kind of a market appraisal approach. The method I've created, and I'm working on getting through a full, like, implementable, you could use it at your own house, I call the lifespan approach. And the notion of this is that all of our equations, no matter what equation we have, is based on values and assumptions. And so let's be explicit about those. So I have two assumptions that I'm starting with, and one is that housing is a human right, and the second is that we have a dialectical relationship with the earth that we live in, and we need to care for it as it cares for us. So those are my, in some ways, they seem like, oh yes. Okay, so how do we put numbers to that? How do we make it something that we can systematize and actually use if those are values that we collectively share? And I think, although not everyone might get behind that, I think most humans in period across the country, but in our country would also, I mean, across the world, in our country would agree with this. So how do we do that? So focusing on this enhancement piece, it's a component-based approach, which basically means you take all the components of a building. So it's roof, it's chimneys, that's what those are called, windows, doors, etc. So I'm always looking at rooms now because I'm thinking about this constantly. So I'm like, okay, the carpet would cost about, this is carpet squares, that's cheaper than like roll-out carpet, right? These are enormous windows, these are extremely expensive, but it has concrete, which is, anyways, again, I spent way too much time in the last 2 years talking to structural engineers. I know just enough to be kind of dangerous. So there are all these things about the actual physical building that we can break apart and figure out what do they value. So how do we value them? Well, I would argue each of them has a lifespan. So if we take a roof, if you put a roof in 2020, and it costs $20,000 to install in 2020. Most roofs, shingle roofs, are estimated to last 20 years. That means it's about worth $1,000 a year. In other words, a realistic depreciation, just like your cars or things, there are things that we're living in. You have to replace that roof. It's not going to just like magically go up because we think it does. It's going to come down in value. So over time, it implicitly comes down in value because of the wear and tear in its existence. The good thing is that things like brick and concrete, they take hundreds of years to come down in value. But the other thing about this is, again, spent way too much time thinking about the details of these things. The vast majority of cost for where we're living in most dwellings in the country is upkeep. Like that's what costs a lot, is keeping it up. So if you rethink about the value is like, yeah, what is it already there? And then let me make that accurate of how much is there so that I actually kind of save, if you will, money to keep it up. That becomes a more sustainable way of thinking about this. So practically, so then, yeah, it's like, okay, let me evaluate each of these based on how much they were when they originally put in, how long we expect the lifetime span to live, what kind of condition it is, et cetera, and then get a value. So practically, how is this happening? So I'm working with various teams to eventually, not there yet, have an application, like phone and tablet application, that will use various kinds of computer vision to scan a property, identify pieces, and then use models to say, most likely this is, you know, this old, built, da 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 da, et cetera. The formal implication of it would be done with a home inspector, so not someone trained in appraising, but actually trained in home inspecting. So they would have background in like all the construction and plumbing things that I don't actually know about. And so it would be both a mix of the computer knowledge and modeling, but also a human, like, oh, this is actually in good condition, this isn't in good, the things that, you know, will take a while to scan. So that is the hope for that. We'll talk about what does that mean number-wise in a second, but I want to turn to the land. Okay, I have a huge favor. Someone, sorry, thank you. I really appreciate it. All right, so this is where we're gonna like jump a second. We think about often in our country land having some kind of inherent value, and we like own it. But I would argue the only way we own it is a settler colonial assumption of ownership. And what I mean by that is it was violently taken, given to settlers for little to nothing, and then the only way that it's maintained is by a legal piece of paper that we pass between people. And if the government decides, hey, actually I want that back, they again take it with violence. And to be real, like our borders are also maintained with violence. And if another government came in and decided all of our papers were not real, like has happened over and over in many countries around the world, they wouldn't be real. So the only way that they're like our understanding of ownership or land is real is by this paper that is maintained by an empire of violence. All right, I know I'm out there, but I love that I'm getting some of you to nod with me. So if we're realistic about that, and thank you, you were like an amazing scene, I really appreciate it. If we're realistic about this, we don't own it. We are renting it in some kind of way, or leasing it, or whatever we want, from our government in exchange for some services. Because, oh yeah, by the way, it's not just if they want it. If you don't keep paying those taxes, you don't got it anymore. So if we're realistic about that, then the only ownership of the land, the only value there, is its relationship to our state. And thus, it should have no value in the exchange of Lisa's living in it and now I'm living in it. So that's no longer a money exchange, because it wasn't a money exchange when our empire came in, and shouldn't continue to be a money exchange. So the only value that we have some kind of collective use for is the fact that there is shared resources that we get out of this. So if there's shared resources, aka property taxes, if you're not following me, hopefully you are. If there's shared resources that we get out of this, how do we operationalize it in a way where it's actually shared resources? So that's what we need to think about. Well, what are we sharing? We're sharing collective infrastructure. We're sharing collective natural resources. So how do we operationalize that and take into account that there's a lot of different social components of benefits and costs of having people live in different elements, and make that, again, into a number. So instead of thinking about property taxes as there's some out there real value of all these properties, which I know is not even how it's happening in Portland, but just like pretend it was, that there's like this real value of what's properties, and then we're gonna create a rate, and then we're gonna multiply it by that, and get this, and let's just hope that properties keep coming up so we get more resources. It's like a really backwards way of thinking about all of this, and we know it has all sorts of detrimental implications. So let's flip that and say, okay, collectively, how much do we need resources? Like, let's set a budget. Like, what do we need collectively? What does that look like? And then let's say, what proportion should Jenny pay? What proportion should Lisa pay? What proportion should Colleen pay? And then that, it's not based on the value, it's based on a proportion of that collective pot. So as that budget goes up, it immediately goes up because it's a proportion of that budget. Y'all follow me, Matt? Okay, so how do we define that? This is where I get a little like, I do think it needs to be a democratic collective process, and I don't think one person should be like defining all that, but of course I have my views, so like, I think there need to be environmental things. Like if you are watering your lawn in Arizona, you need to pay a bigger proportion because you're creating climate change. If you are living in a multifamily dwelling with 10 people in a 2 apartment, you need to pay less because you're helping all of us by taking up less space and collectively helping. If you are someone who stayed for 50 years in your house, you're creating a collective good of social cohesion, and every year you pay a slight less proportion because you are helping the community in that way. Now, if less and less people are living in your house, you might pay a little bit more and more of a proportion for taking up more space, so it might even out. But those are all ways in which we can actually rethink this process. Okay, so those are the big things. If you haven't figured this out by how I'm talking about it, this means that the enhancements will, it should just be the house and not the land. The enhancements will go up and down over time based on what people are putting in. It's not just speculative, it's not just going up, it's not this magic formula. It's like, if I put a new roof on, my house is worth more now, but I just put all the money in, so it's not like I made money, it's just worth more because I put that new roof on. What that means is, the way that we do mortgages don't work. Because the way we do mortgages, this is actually before the extreme hike in interest, but this is principal, this is interest, you just visually see. Now it's even more dramatic. If you, I ran it like 3 weeks ago, so it's not the most recent because it's gone up since then. But if you bought a house for $100,000, right, or you borrowed $100,000 for a house, you would pay right now $180,000, I think it is, in interest. Almost twice as much as the principal in interest. Like, and that's not your fees, that's not your other stuff. So they need to be walking around and like, being like, actually, this house is 3 times more, right? So what that means though, mathematically, is if your house isn't going to speculatively increase in value, it makes no financial sense to be paying the bank all that interest. And the only reason that we maintain that as a system is because of this implicit agreement that it's going to be good for you because your house is going to go up, and we know that that's only true in our, and generally speaking in our country, that's only been true for white people, still only true for white people. So like if you're paying that interest and your house is not going up because of all those other graphs I showed you, this home ownership gig is not a great deal for you. Of course, there's exceptions, but that's a general thing. So what can we do instead? So instead, use a flat rate system. To be very honest, I changed this. It's not actually interest. I shouldn't say interest. I meant to change it. It's a fee because I've been corrected. Because it can't be interest because it's not a proportion. So there's a structure where you're mainly just paying the principal, and there's a little bit of a fee just purely to pay people to manage it. It's not to make money. It's not anything beyond just like there needs to be some administrative component to make this happen. So how do we fund this? So right now, most mortgages are funded based on your all's retirement. That makes sense, right? Because they get sold in secondary housing market, pensions, like blah, blah, blah. So your savings is paying your own or your neighbor's retirement. And we can actually do that same model, but without the stock market and without the banks, such that we are buying bonds collectively in community groups where my house, my savings for my retirement is going directly into my neighbor's house. Now, the catch is, I'm not gonna be making interest on that, but I'm not paying interest. So at the end of the day, if I am not in the top 1%, I'm doing great. I'm doing way better than I was, but it's a shift in mentality. because now we feel like we're getting rich when our retirements are like going up really high, without recognizing that if everything else is going up, that number going up is not helping us. So how do we, again, guys, I use some data to just model out, if it's possible with construction data, what we know about housing, et cetera, looked at this approach versus the conventional approach. On average, across the country, this would be the average cost of an enhancement or a house. What that means, like loan-wise, again, this is from a few months ago, so it's even more dramatic now. And monthly costs would be down, et cetera, et cetera. Rent, I'm just like talking, so I don't have enough time to like go into all the details. But the conception of rent is basically, if you still own it, you don't get to charge on the principal. So you can only charge on the maintenance and the time it's taking you. And if in that model, when you're not paying attention, most landlords, the main thing that their rent payments go to across the country is interest and principal. And so if you're not paying that, then rent can go down dramatically. So looking at all sorts of different equity measures, it benefits. I thought I had a slide, and I didn't put it there, but the average family would save $500,000 in this alternative system, which is way more than the average family retires with. All right, so that is our dream goal. That's where we're going. How do we get there? Now I'm just throwing water everywhere. I'll pause for a second while I'm trying to drink and not throw water. Is there any other like clarification or question? Yeah.
Well, how are community land trusts different from what you're proposing?
Yep.
To feel similar.
Very.
Limited
Yep.
equity, what I'm more direct sharing.
Yep. No, they're similar. They're have a lot of the same basis, and I'm imagining working with a lot of community land trusts. Currently, depending on the land trust and their capacity and their size, a lot of them still use conventional mortgages and still pay interest. And so, although they're not paying for the land, they end up getting kind of this raw end of the deal, and they're increasingly getting a raw end of the deal. And because they're often very localized, it often becomes mobility limiting, because there's not, if you need to move for work or for family or another reason, it's hard to take what you've had this collectively and go other. So it's building off that idea, but trying to say, how can we systemize this into an appraisal? Because they also, if they're using conventional mortgage, they're also using conventional appraisal. And so they have to, there's all these like tweaks on how that is implemented if they don't own the land and there's a ground lease, so there is exceptions there, but fundamentally undergirding it is these same assumptions. Yeah.
Maybe this is something for later, but when you're talking about enhancements and measuring those, how do you account for changes in construction costs? Like if a roof 5 years ago was $20,000, but today it's $50,000 for that same roof, do you incorporate that? So it's
because you didn't pay $50,000 now, you paid $20,000. So it's no inflation, yeah. So what that means is like, sorry, I'm just throwing water everywhere. What that means is older houses that are like 100 years old, they're darn cheap when you use this method. And that's how that, like new houses are really expensive, but old houses are not, because again, they're also gonna take a lot more maintenance to keep up. And so what you're buying is one, I mean, again, I love old houses, they're amazing, but if you can actually pay what like has been paid over time for the current maintenance you get, then you have a lot more resources to allow that house to stay alive in the community and not deteriorate, which is what we need in a lot of ways, climate and social and other ways. So yeah, so how do we get that data? Because actually, if that's gonna be the question, it's a whole nother.
Well, no, so then the other part of this is like, if you have something that is a 20-year lifespan on a $20,000 roof, and it's been there for 25 years, is there a negative value to that, or is it just at zero?
No, at zero is how I'm currently modeling it.
Okay.
Although if you have a strong challenge and want to push back, that's fine. But that's where there's also, so for each of those, it's we expect this to last 20 years, but what is its current condition? And that's where I'm working with like these inspectors, because I'm trying to figure out how, if they look at a roof and they're like, oh, this was put 10 years ago, but it's in like super good condition, then it will be treated like it's younger, if that makes sense. So that's how I'm hoping that we don't just get down to zero, because we're taking that condition into play, but it might be like $50. But at 25 years, if it really was supposed to be a 20-year roof, it probably needs to be replaced yesterday, right? And maybe not if it's really good condition. And that's where these things get exciting, but also really overwhelming, because the condition of things is often very localized. So like roof conditions can, like way too much random crap, but roof conditions really matter on like the kind of amount of rain you get, the atmosphere pollution, like all these kind of things. So it's not just what's the expectation for this kind of roof, but we need like, what's the expectation for this kind of roof in this city at these conditions? So that's sort of like, how precise do you get and how precise can you get? Those are all questions I'm currently debating and I don't know the answers. Okay, so how do we implement change? Also, I'll get through this so we can have some more dialogue. So, you know, there's all these different, from real estate agents to brokers to the appraisers to the developers, there's all these different components of, or actors in this implementation. Sorry, I'm pausing because I just looked at the clock and then I remembered where my slides were and I was like, oh shoot, I'm doing bad. Do y'all want me to like speed devil through? Or do you want me to just like give a quick summary and open more questions? You want more questions? All right, cool, we'll do more questions. The short version is thinking a lot about how government is regulating these pieces. And I was working directly with government to regulate them different in all these different ways. Was it working? So I did a really long historical dive thinking about how has this changed and really thought about how movements have made things like FDR get elected, but then he just goes to the industry and use what they already created to make these innovations and how this happens over and over in housing. And so that's where I got to a place in my own frustration last year of thinking about this dialectical relationship between the industry and government, and that if we really want to influence government, our current system is we have to give them an alternative and almost beat the industry. And so that's why I decided to actually incorporate a nonprofit, which is not my goal at all, to implement these things. So we are trying, working on actually having these apps and these finance, and it would be a national network. So when I say working with community or land trusts, it's like, great, you have the base. Let's have appraising methods in finance that can support what you're already doing and build on that, but have the ability to have the national capital to create an alternative economy. And why does this start affecting the broader economy? Well, that economy is all based on other sales. And so as soon as you get a mass of people using a different method, that other method also starts changing. So even before you get the government to agree, then maybe they need to regulate that method in a different way. You implicitly affect that method by having another method, because that method is maybe not based on much reality. Quick fun fact, and then we'll totally do questions. Also, if you don't know, the appraisal equation is built into our GDP. And so the largest component of our GDP is housing. And the biggest piece of that is our estimate of if every unit in the US went for market rent, how much would it be? So when we've created, not only nationally here, but internationally, a system where land is valued based on the presence of white people, we've created a GDP equation that uses that as the biggest component of the GDP. We've now created an international economy that is justified in the ways that it does World Bank and other loans in this kind of cyclical logic. So if you start changing this, you also start changing those like international traits. Okay, there's all sorts of different components. I'm done. I'm so excited for your questions. Thanks for entertaining me and letting me just keep talking.
I will go first. So, actually, I have a comment. I took my real estate valuation class in grad school.
Nice.
In the business school. So I don't remember thinking that led me to that, but it was useful. But I remember being just struck by the picture of the natural life cycle of a neighborhood. Oh, yes! Yeah. Yes! Yeah.
Colonialism much? Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, but it was just so like, look how this is naturalized into the practice, that there is a normal life cycle of a neighborhood and when you should buy and how you should value. So I don't know, that was like something that really, very.
Does everyone know what we're talking about? You want to give 2 more sentences?
No, I don't remember that well.
Okay, sorry. So it's different people graph it different ways. And I kind of wanted you to, because I don't know how to say it without just sounding real biased, but we're just going to be real biased and be fine about it. So basically this understanding that things can just keep appreciating only works with the cycle of depreciation. Because if houses just like always went up, like no one, like it just increasingly becomes unattainable. Which, quick side note for a second over here, deal a lot with like fair housing, civil rights language, and it's always like, we just need to get people of color, into houses, and like then their wealth will appreciate. But like the more you start thinking about, it doesn't work, but the more you start thinking about it, it's always settler colonial. Because who doesn't live here yet who will be coming to live here, who isn't living here, right? So it's always this like settler, I own this now, my wealth will go up, and not an understanding of who might be coming and not coming. So anyways, that was a side note. But this notion of like, it's always going up really only works if there's cycles of disinvestment and reinvestment. So we see this over and over in our country's history. Chicago is like the quintessential example of this, where it was a swamp land, it was taken from indigenous people, was seen as not valued, right? And like certain areas are seen as increasing in value, and then we label it different times, things at different times, but white flight, all this language we have of then the strategic disinvestment of communities that then become advantageous investments for white people to come in. AKA, we're talking about gentrification, right? But the thing about gentrification is it's only talking about one piece of a cyclical process that is inherently cyclical. And so it's naturalized in a lot of real estate business where like, this is just how you like beat the market. It's like, it happens always and blah, blah, blah. But in reality, it's a race-based approach that only works when you're displacing and disinvesting places that are continually people of color and putting them where they have to overbuy, like most recently in like inner ring suburbs, right? Like they're paying like too much, and then their values are going down, and all of a sudden where they used to live are going up, and those people are then going to move. Like it's just this constant, but it's inseparable from race.
Yeah, and so like my shorthand for it is like when the browns and blacks come, right? Because the one that I sort of was like,
Yeah.
The blacks are coming now. So my question was, I get into this conversation, I love using the retirement example of like, everything is like tied together. And so then the next question is, well, you've got these ideas, but how do we actually implement those ideas given that context? And it's both, I think, like at a micro level and macro level, like how do we actually move forward with that given some of the complexities? Because I agree, like, I think money is just valuation. Like
Yeah.
And like I make my students say the market.
Yeah.
It up.
Yeah.
Right.
Always.
Yeah. So I mean, what would we do to actually build towards that?
Yeah, so I'll just be specific of what I'm envisioning, I'm trying to work, and like what as many people as want to join. So I hinted at pieces of this, but a slow building, like genuinely trying to not just use like big investment money, right? But a slow building bond approach. And why it's bonds is it's like the thing you can do where it's the legal structure we have in the States to like have savings that isn't with securities. So what that genuinely means is, the timing of this is something I'm constantly wrestling with, but I'm hoping to start having people do like $50 a month, $100 a month, right? So literally thinking about their own retirements and whatever that's possible, and if they want to change all of their retirement into an alternative or part of their retirement, or they don't currently save for retirement, but they probably maybe could do $5 if it was accessible for them, right? So it's a like automatic deposit if that's the thing, or community deposit. So it's building that kind of like grassroots, small dollar amounts. And then the next step, strategically, I'm thinking about is two target groups. So one are people who own their houses outright and really could use an equity loan. So I think particularly older families who need a new roof or new windows, et cetera, and could believe in this idea because it would pass on the equity accessibility of housing for the next generation, and could get interest-free loan for their thing. Now, what I didn't fully explain is, like a community land trust, everything that enters the system also has a ground lease process where you have to stay in the system, right? So then you just start collecting, with a lot of explanation, and make sure that they understand what's happening and not exploitative, the best of like, this is what this means, like you can limit all these things. But you start having a stock of houses that when people do want to move or want to live are in the system for people to buy. And then the other are people who could refinance and could really benefit. So I think about people like in my generation who have those who managed to be impossible for various reasons and have a house and know this is all ridiculous and right now could save a ton of money by refinancing into this system and could buy into the idea that yes, this would be good for the future. And then those people, they can simultaneously be saving for their retirement in the same system while they're doing it. So I'm thinking about like trying to create the infrastructure where then communities can like apply it for their local community basically, and scale up from our collective like savings and our houses. Like the more houses we put in, the more capital the system has too. Is that precise enough?
Yes,
Is that what you meant?
That's perfect, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, first of all, thank you for this presentation, super great. In the sort of mainstream conversation about the racial wealth gap in particular, I mean, the primary vehicle that's on offer is, I already see your little arrow there.
Sorry!
It's how my Congress states to engage communities of color in the current system and, you know, and appreciation, right, step 2, question mark, step 3, we're all rich. And so I'm really curious about the reception of like this work, this kind of lingerie, specifically from those kinds of like, you know, like urbanly, nationally, you know, commercial Black caucus nationally, who are very invested in that model.
Yeah. Yeah, no, last summer, I was thinking that is going to be my biggest like resistance from people who could benefit enormously is urban and I mean all the caucuses of like even National Fair Housing Alliance, right? Who I work with often. Right, so there's all these things. I'm particularly concerned about like the Black middle class that's in like their 30s and 40s that have not only been kind of sold, if you will, that your own house, but invest in real estate. So I'm thinking about the people who have like the rental or the Airbnb, like those are like the biggest. And so I think there's two things. One is like, I really am genuinely interested in racial equity. And I think part of this is always checking, is it working, right? Like, and who is and isn't benefiting? Because there's going to be unintended consequences. There's going to be things. The more I've run models, the more confident, and it doesn't mean that there's not still problems. There are, of course, a million problems that have to be worked on the ground. But the more confident I am that even the people who I thought wouldn't benefit, like that person I just like, they would really actually still benefit from the system, even if they had those 2 or 3 or 4 houses. Because who's benefiting from the current system is such a small slice. So I'm wrestling with, I think it's a mix, well, no, it's not a mix, it's a narrative conversation. And the mix within that narrative conversation is explaining how the lie that's been told to you is really a lie. And this is how it's actually affecting you, and figuring out ways, if that's, you know, my brain and how I think about things is like, is there like an interface we can create where people go in and put all their numbers in and they start thinking for themselves, this is the pros and cons of this system versus that system, right? So those kind of narrative pieces. But the other piece that it's not my idea, I was talking to someone who is more brilliant than me and thinks about these things in different ways. They're like, but those same people are all about buy Black and like the Black community building itself up. And like, to what extent do you create and it's not just the Black community, but this particular like segment of it, like what extent can you create a narrative around, we know the banks are continuing to screw us, and so we're putting it in a collective you know, investment that's helping us. And so it's not all the way worked out, but I've thought more about how do you use that framing that they're already using, and a long history of using like, yes, let's be in the system, but let's be slightly outside of the system. Like, let's shop in different places, let's bank in different places. How do you use that to the advantage of saying like, this is actually an alternative that would help you, and this is how, with the combination of like actual numbers, this is how it helps your individual. But I don't know if if it will work, right? But because, yeah. Let's look at that. All right, I want to acknowledge that we're at time. I am happy to keep answering questions collectively or individually, but if you need to get out and leave, do not feel awkward. you are more than free to do that. Yes. Yeah.
Adding to Lisa's question, I get the biggest pushback from students. We have lots of first generation, lots of this is the first person in college never owned a house, and they think that's their goal. And I give them the numbers and they look at me like, yeah, but you just don't know. And they're like, but I'll be the exception. Like that American dream, meritocracy is so inculcated over and over, and like, right, and the pushback. So I think you could get white, liberal, privileged people to buy into this system. Okay, I'm there, I'm with you. But I'm not the one, right? Like, I'm already gonna have access to a bunch of other things. So it's not just the Black middle class community. I just think there's there's so much, that obstacles are so real in that pushback dynamics we get.
Yes, absolutely. But again, I think the white people are the main problem here. So if I get all the white people in the system, I'm happy.
So that's your. I didn't say all the white people. I said the
I'm fighting the IRS right now, and if I'm charitable, and
I'm not like all the white people in this room. Right? You
But that's also why it's different in some ways to our contemporary example of community land trust, because I'm actually very interested in getting the wealthiest neighborhoods in this system. And yeah, their houses are still, even with this, are still out of reach for me, way out of reach for me, and I don't even want to live there anyways. But if they're in the system, again, the current sales comparison approach is all relative, so it don't kind of matter. Like, I'm thinking of this structurally, so it needs to be, but I think it's both and. Like, I'm very interested in white liberal people that have resources buying in, and the more that they buy in, then the easier it is for the immigrant family or the first generation individual or the Black middle class person to be like, oh wait, that house in that neighborhood is in this system? Like, that's an easier step, right? And they have less to lose, and so if they lose it, then that helps the other. But I also think, there's radical political spaces all over the place, right? So it's creating that coalition of people from across spaces without the pressure of like, clear this. And I've been thinking a lot about it. How do you be ruthlessly transparent about like, this is everything, and you make the decision genuinely for yourself with the information that is most helpful to you, and not the last thing I want to do is like come across as like coercing people to be like, let me take your house, and we've got plenty of back history and our country to be like that.
I'm sure you have thought about this, but what are some of the like macro economic implications of the model you're proposing? Is it disinflationary? Like, what are the implications for global economy? I think you kind of mentioned a little bit, because some of the resistance will come from this country, but some of it is going to come from outside, where foreign investors think that U.S. assets are good.
Yeah.
They can buy and save
Yeah.
for their retirement.
Yeah. 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 I have thought about it. Don't have all the answers. I actually Right, I mean, if we're going to dismantle capitalism, we can't dismantle it just here. Like, it has to be dismantled globally. Like, I'm very serious about my dismantling of capitalism. It's, a real thing. Okay, my academic brain has been wrestling on how to operationalize that question and write an academic paper, and it's not there yet. And make it more in a straight, very straight econ kind of argument. But it's something I've been, back my brain trying to play with. The first implications, I think, come with inflation and the Fed. So, I mean, I have a lot of feels about the Federal Reserve too, as you might imagine. And what they're doing with interest rates and inflation and all those kind of things. But all of this is interconnected. And this is also related to, can't remember, it's over here, the question, did you ask me about like, if it was $50,000 now versus, right? So one of the cool, interesting things to think about inflation and macroeconomics is like, why is it $50,000 now? And some of that is because it's actually more expensive to get resources. But the vast majority of that is because of the increased cost of living, and the vast majority of the increased cost of living is our speculative land. So once you actually move to this, it's not just depreciating the value of the housing, it's everything starts going down because labor actually can be cheaper because people don't need, and I'm not trying to say we keep where it is, I'm not trying to say we can pay less, but like it can actually start being livable when it's less costly to live on the land that we inhabit. So then that starts really changing kind of base economic theory about what inflation is and how those tools are used. So, I mean, I come from the I think inflation is inherently problematic because it's a tool to suppress wages, intentionally to suppress wages. But the only way that our government regulates and manipulates inflation is through interest rates. So if you take out the vast majority, the biggest thing that people have interest rates in the country is housing, and if you take out the majority of people from that system, now playing with that interest rate doesn't change inflation like we think it is. So yes, it has so many macroeconomic policies, and not just in the States, as you said, like all over the world. I'm sure there's ones that are more problematic that I haven't got to and thought of, but each one that I've sat with and wrestled with, I'm like, not so great for the banks, not so great for the current 1%. Okay, so I have not, like in my wrestling and thinking through it, I have not found a macro econ implication that I think has negative impacts on equality or working people or the planet. And that's where my values lie, so I'm fine with the implications that it has. But it would wreck all economic theory, like no macro. Which I'm also okay.
Is it the objective to improve the real value of labor or land?
Yes.
Or is it just that, you apply just a downstream effect?
No, I think it's actually to improve it and to recognize what it, have it grounded in something that we have. I mean, those can be shared, can be changed and shared, but have it be an explicit, systematic, this is what this is valued, and let's make sure that value of that labor is equitable. So, I mean, I've also thought about this when thinking about the historical values of the roof and the different pieces. And I hinted earlier that getting that data is, yes. Anyone wants to play with some really hard math data mining issues, let me know, because I'm having a lot of fun and have had some amazing students, but we can use more hands. Because there's tons of property data that traces back hundreds of years with all this information, but trying to, tons of missing, tons of issues. But one of the things is okay, if you have to impute, if you don't know how much it costs to build this brick, then how do you impute that in a way, particularly in the South? How do you impute that doesn't devalue slave labor? There becomes these questions about how do you build into the model and project forward? Because the other piece of this is eventually someone's going to be building a house and we can finance it this way. So how do you come up with a fair evaluation of that build to make sure that that labor is actually a living wage? So thinking about then how do you develop that living wage?
Well, I'm just thinking the roof example, right? Sorry, I just so at some point we're going to become a monopoly in some markets in terms of buying, right? Buying a roof, but you can set your own price. So at that point, how do you prevent your organization from being exploitative towards real business, I guess?
Real business.
People using that.
Yep, I thought about that too, and I mean, again, just quickly, I don't have a perfect answer because I'm monopoly, that's not a good solution. So some of this, and there's you can't, if you haven't picked this up, I'm kind of in the fountain of ideas. So there's pieces of this that have to do with thinking and blah blah, and there are pieces that I genuinely want the government to take over. That is my goal. I think they should be national and they should be democratic run, and I don't think that it should be any kind of non-NGO for-profit or profit. But I think the most effective way to get them to do that is to build it all for them. Here's a thing to put a ball on. Here's some regulations around. That is part of how I wrestle with the monopoly thing is I think things that can be local or federal or state run can help with that as they become a regulatory arm that aren't the businesses implementing it. But it wouldn't fix it all. Like then we're just getting into other political systems that the monopolies are shifted to the government in ways that are also not healthy. So I don't know to what extent is it ranges, like to have, it's exploitative if it's over this or under this, but within there, there's plenty of space, and then how big is within there. And my gut is that that's already kind of how the market works. Like we already mainly have a range. And so if we situate that range on some values, then we're still basically having what we're currently having. It's not like this is the exact value. But maybe I'm being too idealistic. I don't actually know. And the example that I think is most disturbing in a this might not work way is, I don't know how much you know about housing insurance, but housing insurance is increasingly being run by two algorithms, and they have this exact problem, right? It's like a data feeding data problem where they are basically now setting the prices for any kind of repairs, and it's deeply problematic because people are being undercut. So, how do you put different kinds, like the way they're putting input is really problematic because it's a feedback loop that's a continual devaluation of labor. I think you could build something that wasn't valuing that way, but would you end up having the same kind of other implications? And I think it's possible, and so that's where work needs to happen. Like, how do we create something better that still doesn't have these other implications that we don't want?
All right, I'm sure we can continue this conversation forever, but I want to be aware that we are over time, so I want to have all of us thank Dr. Junia Howell. Will be online at some point in the near future, and I'm sure Junia is here for a little bit longer with all of us. If you want to have some conversations and come up and say hi or something like that, that would be great. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a great audience. I appreciated it.